Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. So we talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Rhys Jeffrey. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another video. The Union Home Mortgage Gasparilla Bowl is on Friday, December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, and it's between the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets out of the ACC and the UCF Knights out of the Big 12. So we got a Power 4 conference matchup on ESPN. Both of these teams are 6-6. Both had fairly solid years overall, especially considering when you look at UCF coming into the Big 12 for their first season, and the other teams that joined the Big 12 like BYU, Houston, and Cincinnati, they did not make a bowl game. So UCF was the only new entrant into the Big 12 that made a bowl game. So that was very impressive for Gus Malzahn, even though for his standards at UCF and at Auburn when he was their head coach, he usually does better. But still, for UCF to go to 6-6, that was impressive. And Georgia Tech, they do not go to bowl games very often. They have not been to a bowl game since the Paul Johnson era. So it is very impressive for the Yellow Jackets that they were able to get to 6 wins with a first-year head coach and Brent Key as well. Very impressive. And if you look at the stats for both teams, Haynes King, the starting quarterback for Georgia Tech, he had 2,755 yards, 26 touchdowns, and 15 interceptions. If he could have cut down on the turnovers this year, he would have had a fantastic year. But still, overall, he showcased the ability to use his legs at times, and when he was accurate not turning it over, he was able to allow Georgia Tech to have a fairly explosive passing attack, something that Georgia Tech normally does not have, considering in the Paul Johnson era, they were a triple option team. Now they've become a team that likes to air it out a bit more. It did not work under Jeff Collins, but it seems to be succeeding more under head coach Brent Key, and the fact that Haynes King was the Texas A&M transfer as well probably helped because he is a talented quarterback that needed a starting job, and Georgia Tech gave it to him, and he performed fairly well. Running back Jonathan Haynes, so you've got the Haynes duo and Haynes King and running back Jonathan Haynes. He rushed for 931 yards, 7 touchdowns. He had a fairly solid year. And you had Eric Singleton at wide receiver with 706 yards and 6 receiving touchdowns. And over on the UCF side, you had John Rhys Plumlee, the Ole Miss transfer. He's done a good job for UCF the last few seasons. But this year, he was injured for a few weeks. And that was another thing that kept UCF from probably having a better year. If the Knights had had a fully healthy John Rhys Plumlee throughout the entire season, maybe they could have been an 8-win team. But still, when he played, he had 2,073 yards, 13 touchdowns, and 8 picks. And he's no more for his legs than Haynes King. And since he's healthy now and UCF looked better toward the end of the season, he should be able to use his legs in this bowl game. RJ Harvey had a great year on the ground for UCF, 1,296 yards and 16 touchdowns. One of the more underrated running backs in college football this season. And at wide receiver, Javon Baker, 966 yards and 6 touchdowns. He's a very explosive receiver. So both teams had a fairly solid offense this year, and both teams have fairly solid quarterbacks overall in Haynes King and John Rhys Plumlee. Now, looking at the ESPN FPI predictor, UCF has a 66% chance to win, and Georgia Tech only has a 33% chance to win. So they are favoring the Knights. And if you look at the odds makers, UCF is favored by 4.5 as well. So the odds makers do agree with the FBI predictor that UCF will win this game. But Georgia Tech, they only got 2 guys in the portal. Both of them are on defense. UCF, they got 3 guys in the portal, a backup running back and an offensive lineman as the notable guys. So definitely neither team is really being impacted by the transfer portal and opt-outs, which is good for both teams' chances of possibly being able to win, because a lot of other bowl games are being heavily impacted by guys not playing in the bowl game, especially starting quarterbacks. Both of these teams aren't having that issue, which is great for them. Georgia Tech, the way they performed this year, they started out with a close loss to Louisville, which really showcased that Georgia Tech was a better team this year. If Haynes King did not fumble the football late in the game, Georgia Tech could have won and started off on the right foot, but they couldn't get that win. Then they beat South Carolina State, lost to Ole Miss in a fairly lopsided loss, but that's to be expected with a team as good as Ole Miss was this year. Then they beat Wake Forest, who really struggled this season. Then Georgia Tech suffered their worst loss of the year to Bowling Green. That was a terrible loss. Don't know what they were doing in that game. But then they turned around and knocked off Miami. Now, granted, Miami epically blew the game. Everybody remembers Miami. Instead of kneeling the ball, they ran it and they fumbled, and then Georgia Tech was able to score at the end with like 2 seconds left. That was an incredible win for Georgia Tech. But realistically, the Yellow Jackets should have lost that game and been 5-7. So they were very lucky Miami blew that game. Then they lost to Boston College, which is another bad loss. Yes, Boston College made a bowl game, but still, Boston College is not a very good football team. Then they were able to knock off North Carolina. That win right there, along with the Miami win, helped propel Georgia Tech to a bowl game this year. If they did not beat those two teams, they wouldn't have made it here. Virginia, they knocked off easily. Then they lost to Clemson, beat Syracuse, and they hung tough with Georgia. So you could tell toward the end of the season, they started to play better football compared to where they were earlier in the year, except for that Louisville game. Seemed like Haynes King kind of found a groove. Now, on the UCF side, they were up and down as well, just like Georgia Tech. They beat Kent State, Boise State in close fashion, and Villanova to start the year at 3-0. But then UCF lost to K-State, Baylor, and Kansas, and Oklahoma, and West Virginia to have a 5-game losing streak. But the Oklahoma and Baylor losses were in agonizing fashion. They should have beat Baylor because they were up big in that game, but they allowed Baylor to score 30 unanswered points in the second half, and they blew that game. It was unbelievable. And then Oklahoma, they took down to the wire, but they just fell short. But at least that showed that UCF was capable of competing in the Big 12 this year as a newcomer. Then they knocked off Cincinnati, which they had to knock off the Bearcats if they were going to make a bowl, which they did. But then they got their big win of the year over the Oklahoma State Cowboys, 45-3. I think Oklahoma State had a letdown game after knocking off Oklahoma, but still, this is mighty impressive. No one was expecting that. The Cowboys were a top 25 team for most of the year, and UCF was able to get a win by 42 points. Very impressive. Then they lost to Texas Tech in close fashion. Then they beat Houston at the end of the year to achieve bowl eligibility. So definitely UCF and Georgia Tech both had some games that if they did not win, they wouldn't have made a bowl, but they were able to find a way. Both Brent Key and Gus Malzahn, I think, are solid coaches, especially Gus Malzahn has the experience, did a good job leading UCF in their first season in the Big 12, but Brent Key deserves a lot of credit as well for getting Georgia Tech to a bowl game for the first time in many years. Haynes King and John Rhys Plumlee are both solid quarterbacks. Neither team's dealing with a lot of opt-outs, so this actually should be a very solid bowl matchup between two teams that are pretty good on offense. Both have solid quarterback play. Me and WillND break down the Gasparilla Bowl and whether we believe that Georgia Tech out of the ACC can make the conference look good and get their 7th win of the year by knocking off a Big 12 team in UCF, or will UCF cap off a fairly successful first season in the Big 12 by achieving a winning record and being able to knock off the Yellow Jackets and help the Big 12 get a good-looking win for Bowl Mania? Georgia Tech, UCF.
This is a good game.
The Union Home Mortgage Gasparilla Bowl. Man, these sponsorships. And the spread is UCF 4.5. You've got two guys for Georgia Tech. Edge rusher. I think he was actually one of the better ones. We remember seeing him.
Yeah.
And Keenan Johnson. And then UCF's got a running back, an inside O-lineman, and Fred Davis II, who they don't even have listed as a position.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. So, definitely you've got another example of two teams that were inconsistent this year. UCF obviously just made the jump from the group of 5 to the Big 12. We're up and down all year. But they beat Oklahoma State 45-3, but then they had some bad performances. UCF had a couple just dreadful performances. Like, I mean, I don't even know what to really think about either team. Georgia Tech played well at times, and then they lost to Bowling Green. So, if Haynes King's playing and John Rhys Plumlee, I mean, that's a pretty decent QB battle. Both teams have decent quarterbacks. I mean, Haynes King's had a pretty good year. Rhys Plumlee, when healthy, is solid. But I will say, UCF's look better now that he's back, Rhys Plumlee. When they didn't have him for a while, they were struggling. I'm going to go with UCF to win 28-24. I like Rhys Plumlee. I think his legs will be able to get the Knights the victory.
I don't know, man. I'm going to pick Georgia Tech. I don't know. I think it's a good story that they finally made a bowl for the first time since the Paul Johnson era. This is kind of a bias. This is kind of a me wanting them to win pick, but I don't know. I think it'll be a good game. I'll go 24-17 the Jackets.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an underrated game. It's going to be one of those games that people are going to want to tune into, especially if the quarterbacks play. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Comment down below whether you think that Georgia Tech or UCF will win the Gasparilla Bowl and why, and what you think about me and WillND's pick for this bowl game. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I'll see you next time.